Okay, welcome back everyone to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. I apologize if I sound a little different this week. I'm running a low grade fever and haven't been feeling the best, but I'm bored, got nothing else to do, so I figured I'd crank this episode out. So, I got a lot of questions from various people about my methodology and my methods and the ways that I went about things that I didn't really have time to go through in the main podcast, or I didn't think people would actually be interested in how I did things and how I operated doing things. So I will basically just answer as many questions as you asked that I could. So the first question that got asked was, how do you identify autistics online? What is your actual process and methodology for identifying them? And that's a great question. It is not as easy as you might think. And a lot of autism studies that do the same thing that I'm trying to do, I often critique pretty heavily because they rely on identification methods that automatically bias their sample sets. So they will do basically the easiest thing to identify an autistic person, which is to scrape social media bios and look for a hashtag actually autistic, or search through posts and look for a hashtag actually autistic, or in their bio they say autistic or something like that, and then they'll grab their posts. This isn't a great way to identify autistic people, by the way, online. This will pretty much only get you the sample set of autistic people who are interested in autism advocacy and activism, which is a very small percentage of autistic people online. The vast majority of autistic people, when they post, don't use hashtags like actually autistic. It is the behavior of a very niche online subgroup of autistic people. And basing your answers on those groups biases your data in, I think, a really bad way. And so, I just don't think it's a particularly good thing to do, but that it is easy to do. And it's one of the easiest ways of identifying people. Another really easy way of identifying autistic people is to look at autism specific forums and just see who's posting there and do like an analysis of the posts where people are like, I'm autistic, because they'll often volunteer that information, or I've been diagnosed for 3 years, or I've been DX'd for 3 years, or something like that. And then once you identify the user, you could scrape everything else they're saying. Other things, social media groups, like social media categories or like Facebook groups and things like that, specifically for autistic people. That's a really good way of identifying autistic people. Basically, just like the easiest one is to just look for them literally just saying, I'm autistic. That does create some false positives, mostly because calling yourself autistic is like a meme that's often used in lieu of a different slur, which I will not repeat on this podcast. However, it is used by people as a sort of self-depreciating term to indicate that they are stupid. And so you do also have to account for that, and you have to look at things more in aggregate. So just because a person says I'm autistic in one post doesn't mean they're autistic, and you have to analyze the tone of the post and why they're saying they're autistic. If they're saying it in like response to a meme page or something like that, it's probably going to get you a false positive. But there are all sorts of things that you can do with that. Those are all the easy methods, and those are all the methods that people doing online autism studies usually get. However, these are not good methods, at least not good methods if you're trying to get an actual representative population set of online autistics. And then you have to move on to much more, I'll say, sophisticated techniques. One of the big things, and one of the ways that in the intelligence world you find people and you find people of certain predilections, is something called association graphs. So you can think of association graph as a node graph. So you as a person are one node, and then looking for various things like who your friends are on social media and who you're posting on, who you're commenting on, basically the places that you tend to visit, the places that you tend to frequent, any forum group memberships, any cross memberships, things like that. And it's pretty obvious when someone is autistic just because they will often have association graphs that, when you draw them out, are heavily clustered with other autistic people and other autistic things. Another example of this is like interest node graphs. So interest node graphs are the types of things they tend to post about. And so these things would be like, I don't know, young men and World War II German tanks. That's a pretty common one in the autism community. And so just seeing them post about that sort of stuff and then breaking it down and going even further. Now, people are probably going to hear this and say, wow, that sounds like you will misattribute or you will find the wrong people. And absolutely. So these methods are not like foolproof, bulletproof. They're absolutely going to find an autistic person. What these do is these create confidence intervals. And so you look for all these factors and you create an additive sum of all the factors. And using the additive sum of all those factors, you rate confidence that someone is autistic. And then if they're a high level of confidence, you switch from automation to doing manual analysis and see if you as a human can pick up something that, your algorithm might not have been able to pick up. There's also, especially now, the ability to use LLMs to basically sort through and summarize people's posts. And so you could do things like collect a large amount of data and then say, based on these posts, does this person indicate that they're autistic and why? LLMs, of course, are not great. These aren't like super effective, but what they are really good at is finding turns of phrases like, yeah, I think I'm autistic, or I was diagnosed, or things like that. Ways of identifying that you're autistic without sort of saying it explicitly and doing what is often called sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis is identifying the tone or the mood or the thing trying to be conveyed in a sentence. All this stuff is really quite complicated, and if you are a sort of linguistics LLM person, you probably already know about this type of thing. But you can do that. And so you can basically take a huge combination of lots of different methods for identifying people and then just point them at various autistic people on social media. And oftentimes you'll get like graphs and confidence intervals of people and their posts to see what is the chances that they're autistic. If they interact with lots of hobbies where you typically find lots of autistic people, if they have lots of friends who are known designated autistic who have already tagged as autistic, if they're frequently interacting with autistic people, if they are engaged in discussions about autism, if they are involved in other forums and things like that, these can build sort of confidence intervals that will allow you to more easily identify autistic people. So the next way that you identify autistic people is through techniques and special applications of specific ways of thinking and understanding data that are very hard. And the chances are, if you have not worked in an intelligence background, you probably won't think about these things. I'll start with one of the biggest ones, which is homophily clustering. So homophily is a term used to describe, like in sociology, where people sharing like characteristics tend to find each other, and when they find each other, they tend to clump. And autistic people have huge, very high levels of homophily clustering on the internet. And so just looking at those clumps, and when you find one autistic person, you go through their comments, their mentions, and things like that to find other people. And then you use those other people to go through analysis and all the stuff that I said before to verify. And yeah, you can find a lot of autistic people this way. In fact, this is one of the ways that I was able to actually survey and identify conservative autistic Christians. Because conservative autistic Christians, for a very wide variety of reasons, tend not to openly identify as autistic. They tend not to label themselves as autistic, and if they know they're autistic, they usually keep it on the DL. However, one of the ways that you can find them, and one of the ways that I found a lot of them, is by finding a conservative person who is autistic, and then looking at all his friends, or looking at all her friends, and who she regularly talks to, and then doing more deeper analysis of those things. And this is where the next part comes into play, where I basically just send verification messages. So they're pre-formatted messages specific to the platform that I'm using. That'll be like, "Hey, I'm an independent autism researcher. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing. From my records, it looks like you might be on the autism spectrum. Can you just confirm this with me?" And oftentimes, I got really, like, when they did respond, got really high response rates of people saying, "Yeah, like I actually am. How did you know?" And I'd be like, "Well, you gave it away in your post," but really, it's like I don't have time to explain to you my Multigo plugins. I use a tool, an open source tool called Multigo is what I use to do most of my analysis, and then I build plugins for it. And it's super useful, especially for doing open source intelligence work. If you have worked in the community, you'd probably be familiar with all the tools and functions, and that's basically it. So another thing is topic posting clustering. So I have a very large amount of autistic Christians and ex-Christians that I have verified as being autistic. And I take their posts and I use those posts to pull characteristics and then try to apply those characteristics to people who I don't know are autistic, who might be, or who could potentially be. And so you could think of this as like machine learning language training and training data for just basically I have a lot of it. And so then I analyze posts, I take out characteristics of those posts, and then I analyze those against other features from known autistic people and do things like that. Another really big thing is something that I call frequency and intensity clustering. Autistic people aren't unique in any specific way. There is nothing that an autistic person will say that a non autistic person wouldn't say. Perhaps save some phrases like, "I was diagnosed as autistic." Typically, non autistic people don't say that, typically. But what you can do is you can look at the frequency about which they post about topics. Autistic people often develop special interests, and they'll often develop special interests around common categories and common types of categories. And so just looking at how often they make those posts and looking at how often they do things like that is usually a really good indication to increase that confidence interval, or just looking at people in places that tend to have a lot of autistic people, looking at their patterns. Go to a model train club and just look at the guys posting lots, commenting lots, and commenting and posting specific types of things, and you're likely to find autistic. Another one that most people don't realize and recognize is what's called pattern of life analysis. So pattern of life analysis is basically looking at when you post and the types of things you post and where you post them to figure out where your most likely time zone is and how you live your day, what you do throughout your day, those types of things. Like, are you employed? Are you not employed? If you aren't employed, or if you are employed, what type of work are you likely in and where are you likely doing it? All these things come from a broad set of tools called pattern of life analysis, which just a lot of people don't know how much information they give away on the internet, not by just like posting things, but just the way that they post things and when they post things that can help analyze who a person is and where approximately they are. One of the reasons that I'm able to determine that someone's from America or from the UK is just look at when they're posting. Now, this isn't a perfect metric. Again, the best way to confirm is just to message them and be like, "Yo, where are you from?" But in a lot of cases, people don't respond to DMs and things like that. And yeah, pattern of life analysis is really good for that. Also, doing things like de-anonymizing and cross-posting analysis. So finding anon accounts and finding anon accounts who are associated with other anon accounts and how they post, where they post, and if those posts align with any specific person that it also exists. So I could go through a few case studies of this, but one of the ways you can figure out who runs the account and wokeness is by looking at when they post, the frequencies at which they're posting, and compare that against other figures on the far right. And then also look at the fact that they use certain characters to try to evade keyword detection. And because they're using those characters, you look for other people who post at around the same patterns and also use those characters. And then you can figure out who it is pretty quickly. Those aren't, of course, the only factors. Those are the easiest ones to explain. But de-anonymizing is something that you can do a lot to also find autistic people, because often they'll post behind an anonymous shield. And you want to figure out, okay, maybe I can't figure out who you are in real life, but I could at least build a profile of your rough demographic information, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, what approximate time zone you live in, like ±3, that type of thing. Another thing is cross-platform analysis. So finding people on one platform and then looking for them on another. And then once you found them on those other platforms, redo all the analysis steps that I talked about in the beginning. All these things are really complicated and take a lot of time and have probably represented hundreds and hundreds of hours of development work to just get these in the state where I can use them and use them for this. It's not easy, but yeah, that's basically how I did it. So a lot of applied analysis using techniques that I know to work and just applying them for autistic people. How can you be sure is another question that I get. Like, how do you know for a fact someone's autistic? I did a lot of spot checking, just firing off emails and being like, hey, are you autistic? Or firing off DMs being like, hey, are you autistic? That type of thing. A lot of times people will just confirm they're autistic in their posts by saying, I was diagnosed X years ago, or I'm self-diagnosed, that type of thing. And like I said, I do account for people memeing and using autism as like a slur or a joke or like a self-depreciating comment. And another really fun statistic is in this research, I identified at least 7,500 potential autistic accounts that were not diagnosed as autistic. And then over the years, they posted that they were officially diagnosed. So I know a lot of these techniques actually do work, because they'll find undiagnosed autistics who are posting. And then a few years later, they're like, I'm autistic. Haha, my algorithm knew that before you did. A lot of people are undiagnosed and not aware. For me, what I do if they're undiagnosed or if they're self-diagnosed is I put them in like a special category where I weigh the data less heavily, is basically what it comes down to, so that I'm not making predictions based on people who aren't actually autistic. Self-diagnosis does happen. Typically happens when you're much younger. And so one of the reasons that I time gate things, like one of the reasons I don't study autistic teenagers, is because the chances that they'll miss self-diagnose are extremely high. And especially like young girls who are heavily active on TikTok, they will often frequently self misdiagnose. And on Tumblr, there's a lot of mis self-diagnosis and things like that. Or they'll be like, turns out I wasn't autistic, I was, something else. So okay, cool. Yeah. Generally speaking, though, from my data collection, self-diagnosis usually tends to be pretty accurate. It usually, and people who are self-diagnosed usually tend to conform pretty closely to their diagnosed counterparts. And a lot of people find this controversial, but I don't know. If you're self-diagnosed and it passes the sniff test, if you're self-diagnosed and you fall within the ranges that I expect autistic people posting on the internet to fall, yeah, you're probably autistic. But yeah, I'll tend not to weigh them as heavily in my data, mostly just because it is that way. I haven't noticed any specific things in self-diagnosed autistics that I don't realize in diagnosed autistics. There's no tell that someone's self-diagnosed. There's nothing in that. One thing that I do, though, is if I find a self-diagnosed person who does have anomalous behavior that doesn't fall into the range of normal for autistic people, is I tend to weigh them even less heavily. So if they're saying or doing something where it's like, this isn't a thing that autistic people normally do, then I'll try to correct for that in various ways. But generally speaking, I've found self-diagnosis over the age of 25 to be relatively accurate. It varies in accuracy based on the population, though. So just I keep these things with an open hand. Generally speaking, some demographics tend to be more precise in their self-diagnosis than other demographics, but yeah, that's about it. All right, so that's how I identify autistics. But another thing I do is I send out surveys. And so I've sent out a lot of surveys and I've done a lot of surveying Overall, I'm not a huge fan of surveys, mostly just because they're very hard to write for autistic people. And a lot of the data that I get from surveys, I need to follow up on and check on. And a lot of times, just the way I phrase questions makes a response very different. Overall, I have sent out 76 unique surveys. And in those surveys, I have sent out 951 questions. Of those 951 questions, 338 were unique. And over the past 10 years, I've got around 15,000 responses from various surveys that I put out. I already talked about why surveys are so hard to do in the podcast for autistic people, but one of the most consistently accurate ways of getting survey data is to ask a survey question and then put a little box underneath and just say, can you explain why you chose that answer? And oftentimes, what I found when I do that is a lot of them will check the answer that I wasn't expecting them to check. It's just very difficult. And often, though, one of the best things that comes out of surveys is I have a question at the end being like, do you want to be interviewed for this research project? And they'll say yes. And so often that's been like the actual best source of survey data, is just when people fill out the survey and then agree to do a long form interview. Overall, it's very hard to ask the right questions and to give the right responses to those questions. It's also very hard to verify that the person who is filling out the survey is actually autistic. Like, that is much harder to do than it is from scraping their posts, because surveys are often just anonymous. And I'm not going to ask them for like their diagnosis information. I basically just ask, are you diagnosed, self-diagnosed, that type of thing. And I generally hope people are filling out the surveys in good faith, but you can't always be sure about that. And nothing, though, in the surveys has ever led me to having any sort of anomalous conclusions, or survey data differs heavily from any other sort of data stream. The difficulty with making surveys where you put a little box underneath to get them to explain their reasoning is basically all the reasons that you do surveys to basically like mass large amounts of data, and mass large amounts of data in a way that's like quick, easy, decisive to get a straw poll of where everyone's feeling, defeats that purpose, because you ask them to explain, and often you have to manually go through those answers. And just running surveys are much more logistically challenging, and then dealing with the survey data afterwards is much more logistically challenging. I learned that having an other response basically just screws your whole survey. So if you have an other response, a lot of people will choose other and then specify like, I would have checked A, but the way that you worded it makes me think that I don't agree with A, and so I've chosen other. Okay, I wanted you to choose the answer that best fit, but I don't know, it is what it is. It's also much harder to gauge sincerity and seriousness for surveys if a person actually means what they say when they select a thing. People also answer surveys in trollish ways, especially shorter surveys, and a lot of times you can get like the amount of time it takes them to complete surveys, and some of them will just run through answering questions randomly. So you have to throw those things out. Yeah, surveys are very difficult, and I generally am not a huge fan of them, just overall. They're especially hard to do a deep dive into, and especially on complex topics, they're really hard. So I already talked about how I identify autistics, but once I identify them, I go through post harvesting, where I basically scrape as many of their posts that I can, and I just look through them basically. This is often like a really good source of data. It's also way faster than doing interviews. It's also extremely informative and very useful. Or like finding an autistic person's blog and then going through their whole blog is something I do a lot of, and pulling things out, figuring out which topics in the blog that I care about learning about, things like that are very good. Often, my biggest issue with this method is I go through and I'm like, wow, this data is amazing. These are great posts, but I have so many questions that I want to ask, and I want to know more. And often I will ask them, like, you said in this paragraph X, what did you actually mean by that? Did you mean statement one, statement two, statement three, etc., etc.? Sometimes the demographics of posts are hard to determine, but some aspects of them are a lot easier. Like, you could usually tell if someone is a man or a woman. You can usually tell where their geo is and other characteristics. People like just identify themselves with community markers to be like, I'm part of the gay community or whatever. And so you can identify those things much better. So the source of data that I am most confident in, and the one where I feel like I get the best answers, is long form interviews and long form conversations, which are literally just me talking to people and me just like saying, hey, what do you think about these issues? It is by far the best and the highest quality data that you can get, because during the conversation you can be like, hey, what do you actually mean by that, or do you mean this, or do you mean that? And you can also say, like, they'll have a hard time expressing themselves, and so you'll say, look, these are the types of things that autistic people typically say to me, do any of these match? And they're like, oh wow, yeah, actually option 2 matches very well with what I was thinking. Because with autistic people you have to bridge the alexithymia gap in a lot of places, and you have to explain things, and a lot of time autistic people just aren't willing to disclose things because they don't think it's relevant, but in long form interviews you can usually do that. Long form interviews also like really help to develop trust relationships with people where they are very happy to keep talking to you. And typically I found that people who do long term or long form interviews are the types of people who tend to make the best repeat research people, so to keep asking questions too, and things like that. Yeah, I just, the best way to figure out what someone thinks about something is to sit them down for 90 minutes and go, okay, what do you think about X? What do you think about Y? What do you think about Z? Why do you think about the things the way that you do? Have you ever considered this? There is definitely a trade off between speed of gathering data and data quality, where it's way slower to do long form interviews, but the data quality you get is way better. And it's a trade I'm very easily able to make. I don't have deadlines. Like, I don't have a day my research needs to be published. I'm not doing a PhD or anything like that. So I'm more than happy to say, yeah, I'll basically just do very long form interviews with autistic people, because the data I get is way better, and it helps me like build out a better picture. And it also helps me not only build out a better picture, but figure out other trends that I see with other autistic people posting online, because autistic people tend to be pretty similar to each other. They tend to cluster in groups, and when they're clustering in groups, those people in those groups, you can usually make pretty good predictions about what they are or are not going to say. And so like finding people in those and categorizing them based off that is really interesting and important. It's also just much easier for me to do. Like, I have executive function issues, like many autistic people, and it's way easier to just put a calendar invite for an evening and just sit down and talk to someone, and then run that interview through a speech to text converter, and then put that into a database. And also, while I interview people based on what they say, I select, like, I have basically a survey that I fill out while they're talking to me, where I basically go, yep, they responded this way or this way or this way. And yeah, it significantly reduces miscommunication. It also really helps if they're self diagnosed to do a long form interview with them. I've done long form interviews with many self diagnosed people, and sometimes when I'm doing the interview, I'm like, oh, yeah, if you're not autistic, no one's autistic. But other times I'll do a long form interview and I'll be like, this does explain many things, where it's like, I'm not entirely sure that was an accurate self diagnosis. Of course, I don't actually know the people, but when someone basically gives no answers that align with what autistic people usually say, or they give very few answers that align with them and they're self diagnosed. And I often ask them how they knew they were autistic or how they found out they were autistic. Then sometimes they're like, I watched this TikTok or I follow this meme page. And it's like, okay, that is often a first step in a lot of people's self diagnosis journey. Like, I'm not bashing that. I'm not saying if you first learned you were autistic from TikTok or a meme page that this isn't a somehow valid self diagnosis. Often it is accurate. It's just like, is it the most accurate? Or could there be some flaws in there? And the answer is obviously yeah. And if you are self diagnosed and you don't accord to the norms that I would expect, like you're a weird statistical outlier, I often go, okay, that is odd for sure. That being said, I don't throw them out. I just put them in a different pile and go, this is what this type of person says. But like I said before, self diagnosis is usually pretty accurate. Another question I get is about controls and control groups and how I manage to compare autistic people to non autistic counterparts. And I will start by saying controls are extremely hard to find, and good controls are very hard to find in this research. So often, if you aren't autistic, or if you don't know other autistic people, or you aren't invested in the well being of autistic people, you don't want to fill out a survey about autism, or you don't want to fill out random surveys that an autism researcher sends you. And I have sent out surveys and asked questions where it's just I'm just interviewing Christians about their faith. Can you fill this out for me? Sometimes they do. Sometimes you get good responses. Sometimes you don't. It is all over the place. And often the people who are interested and willing to fill out and participate in surveys or long form interviews are the type of people who are deeply familiar with autism in a way that makes them probably a bad representative control. But that being said, I've spent a lot of time actually trying to find good, reasonable controls. It's just, it's very hard. And if I had more time, or if I had a team working with me, or if I had access to resources where I could better reach out to people, I would love to be able to do that. But the reality is, I just don't. I don't have that time. I don't have the money. And also, I just much prefer talking to autistic people about their faith than random non autistic people. If I'm just being honest, I find talking to autistic people far more interesting. That being said, one of the groups that always responds to my surveys and is very interested are like seminarians. So seminarians are always like, I'm down for a good survey. I'm down for a good interview about faith and things like that. And so you can often find a lot of non autistic seminarians who are willing to do that. But again, seminarians aren't good representative controls because they're in seminary, right? Or if they're in like a theology course or studying theology and they're not autistic, it's okay. And sometimes you talk to them and it's, are you sure you're not autistic? Like you're checking all the boxes here, buddy. But yeah, that's how it is. It's just very hard to get them and to get them to participate and to get them to meaningfully participate if they don't have any sort of investment in this. Another factor I found is the people who are most enthusiastic about participating in these surveys tend to be control groups of people who have very high rates of undiagnosed autism. The people who most likely to respond to my surveys and to volunteer for interviews are engineers, IT workers, tech workers, programmers, and people with advanced STEM degrees or other like advanced degrees, like people doing their masters or PhDs. And it's like, okay, sure, this is great, but also, am I actually getting a good control here, or am I just getting a bunch of undiagnosed autistic people? I've found a lot of undiagnosed autistic people who I interview, and I'm like, have you ever considered this? Have you ever just thought about it, or maybe given it a thought? And they do, and then they come out autistic, and so that's useful data for other things, but not useful for a control group. One way that it is easy to find controls is to just go through Christian groups online, go to Christian Twitter, go to Christian Reddit, go to Christian Instagram, ask questions there, bother people, be like, hey, what do you think about this? And things like that. So I've done an enormous amount of that. The difficulty there is it's very hard to figure out exact precise demographics to know if you're measuring those demos against other known demos. Usually you can find out some demographics and then do sorting based on that. Yeah, that's typically how it goes. That's how I find most of my controls is doing analysis of just Christian Twitter, trying to find rough demographic matches and people who have a low confidence of being autistic, and then just comparing those posts to autistic posts. And there are very stark differences between a lot of these things. Yeah, another good way is going through just Christian media out there that's by non-autistics for non-autistics. This is usually like a really rich source of control data because there are lots of sermons, there are lots of books, there are lots of like online apologists who aren't autistic. There are a lot of online pastors and Christian influencers and things like that just post about things all the time. And there sometimes this data is very useful. Like sometimes it's okay, this is great. I can establish that there clearly isn't a trend here that there is with autistic people. But there's also the fact that, especially on social media, people aren't really honest about things, and people often, especially Christians, often will lie to save face in a way that autistic Christians simply aren't willing to lie to save face. And so you get these situations where autistic people are just explaining their unfiltered, uncut reflections on Christianity, but the Christians will be posting their filtered and cut responses to various things in Christianity. And autistic people are just much more likely in general to admit awkward, uncomfortable things and just say awkward, uncomfortable things and say the thing out loud that no one else is willing to do. And so sometimes you get like a sort of social stifling effect amongst non autistic control groups that can lead to your data being a bit skewed. But there are also places where you can find lots of Christians who are struggling. It's very easy to find deconstructing autistics and deconstructing non autistics and compare the two groups. And let me tell you, the differences between them is stark. Very wild to look at the differences. And so some of these control groups are actually easy. So deconverting and deconstructing Christians, very easy. Autistic moms versus non-autistic moms, autistic dads versus non-autistic dads, autistic seminarians versus non-autistic seminarians, autistic priests versus non-autistic priests. These things are very easy to take a look at. But when it comes to just like regular random autistic people and then a suitable control for them, that gets a lot harder to find like good representative controls. But that being said, I have tried very hard to actually get the ground truth for the non-autistic people and figure out the things with non-autistic people that I do with autistic people. Another question that I get is about what is it that I really think that I'm doing with this research? Do you conceptualize this as a data science project or something else? And I don't really consider it data science. There, in order to do proper data science and proper like long-term analysis, I would need to do things very differently, and I would need a lot more time, and I'd need a lot more resources, and I would need a team to basically do all the things that I'd want to do. And so instead of doing data science, I actually do what is often called ethnography. So ethnography is a survey of people, how they live, and just like living amongst them and detailing what you found. I often describe what I'm doing as very data driven ethnography or like data centric ethnography, where I'm not really looking as much for subjective qualitative things. I'm looking for quantitative things. But yeah, in a controlled lab environment, in a way that like if I were to do my PhD in this, I would go about things very differently than I have. But I haven't gone that way because one, I was never planning on publishing this. I was never planning on doing like actual hard science with this, but more just like figuring this out because it was a problem I was very interested in. And there are a lot of restrictions that scientists have to put on themselves to make it past an ethics board that I didn't. And it's funny, I talked to a lot of scientists in this field just to make sure that I'm doing things properly or to make sure that I haven't missed something or to see if they have a better idea of how to run something. And they're always like, I'm so jealous of what you are allowed to do versus what other people are allowed to do. And yeah, I see myself less as a person studying autistic people for science, but more as a intelligence officer trying to get people an accurate and realistic picture of what the actual state of the ground is. And so rather than following the sort of stricter guidelines of scientific research, which I think has lots of value and is very important and is very useful for a lot of things, I've just decided that I was going to figure it out. No restrictions, no holds barred, just the rules are if I can see it, I can use it type of thing. And that being said, I still go through to what people might consider absurd lengths to make sure I keep the data protected. And I do follow like a lot of guidelines for like proper data management and proper data storage to ensure that none of this stuff leaks, because a lot of times people tell me very sensitive things. And so I do a lot of anonymizing. When you hear quotes from autistic people, if you hear my summary of the quote, or if you hear my voice quoting them, it's almost never what they actually said. And it is an anonymized version of it. because I don't want you to be able to use features from extracts of things they say and use them to find the person online. As a policy, I don't connect other autistic people together unless both of those people explicitly ask to be connected with another type of person like them. And then sometimes I'll do it, but even then, it just gets into like really murky ethical territory, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong, and so I often just don't do it. The reality is, though, like, I have a full-time job, right? This is not my actual day job to do this type of research, and so I have to figure out how much time I actually have to spend on this and what is the best bang for my buck. How am I going to get the most useful information out of this in the amount of time that I have dedicated to it? I'm also just like got a kid. I've got other things to worry about. I have a wife. These things require more time and energy than they did before I had them. And I just basically I need to make trade-offs. And one trade-off that I made that most people in the sort of sciences wouldn't make is I often interfere with my test subjects or with my data collection sphere. So what I mean by interfere is that I'll intervene to help them. So a lot of times what I've realized very early on is autistic people are very lonely, very isolated, very sad, very confused, and often just want someone who understands them. They want to talk to someone who understands them, and they want someone who can help them, and someone who can help them piece together the world in a way that they can't really. And the proper thing to do in an actual controlled experiment would be to say, no, like, we need this separation between us, or else I'm not going to be able to make these objective judgments. But that's just a price that I'm not willing to pay to do this work. Like, I think at the end of the day, I need to use this research for the good of autistic people and to help autistic people. And although that makes me less objective, and although that is typically considered very bad field practice, it is something I do mostly because I'm not getting paid for this. I'm not actually doing this in like a controlled thing. I am doing my best to understand this group. And if you don't want to understand this group, if you don't care about these things, then it's fine, whatever. I don't care. This is not something that I am deeply concerned with, but I personally think it would be immoral to not help the autistic people that I meet who are really going through a bad time. So yeah, um, that's how I do things and how I conceptualize this product. Another thing I will say is I take really good, extensive notes of things and I track and profile things quite well. And I think I do that part really well. So it is, it's more on the hard sciences than maybe other people would be, but that has less to do with me wanting to be objective, but more with just how I think about things and how I think the best way to figure out something is to just like, find data sets, sample data sets, find representative sample controls, compare against controls, those types of things. So I keep pretty extensive notes. I take notes on an offline laptop that doesn't get connected to the internet. The notes are basically just thoughts about the people I talk to and the types of things they say and their posts and the things they say to me. And usually I keep those under a pseudonym for a person. I often get asked, "Oh, can I see my notes?" And I say no, um, mostly because I just don't want to have to deal with the administrative overhead of dealing with that. I don't want people to or I don't want people to request things and then I have to go through all the requests and then I have to anonymize all the notes because sometimes it's like they're interacting with this person and things like that. Anyway, it's way too hard to do. That being said, this laptop never gets connected to the internet and it gets encrypted when it's not in use. So your notes are safe if you're worried. They also don't contain your real name in them. Yeah. Self diagnosis. So we talked a little bit about this. Is self diagnosis valid? I'd say broadly, yes. Broadly, it is an accurate metric. If you self diagnose, the chances that you have incorrectly self diagnosed are quite low, especially if you're like older than 25. If you're older, the chances that you've incorrectly self diagnosed are pretty low. Usually, the complications with self diagnosis come when you have multiple co occurring things and autism gets confused for something else, or something else gets confused for autism. Is it accurate? Mostly. Like, I have not found good enough data to suggest it's not. And if I did, I would probably change things up. But also, I find a lot of self diagnosed autistics later go on to be diagnosed if they can. A lot of them who also can't get self diagnosed. I find a lot of their predictions to be pretty accurate. The only cases in which I found it to be pretty inaccurate is if they are teenagers and they have many other co occurring mental health issues, or if they are part of certain online subcommunities. So I have found groups of people who are like, oh, yeah, we're all autistic. We'd love to talk to you about this. And I I talk to them about how they know they're autistic, and they usually just can't define what autism is accurately. They don't know what autism is. And so it's like you've self diagnosed as this thing that you don't know about, actually. One of the easiest ways to tell if self diagnosis is accurate is to basically say, oh, why do you think that you're autistic? And just listen to their answers. And 90% of the time, if it is likely an incorrect self diagnosis, the reasons that they give for thinking they might be autistic will probably not be reasons that you should self diagnose. That's basically what it comes down to. Another question with self diagnosis is like, who cares? Does this actually affect anyone? And this is a really complicated conversation. The short answer is overall, I don't think it has a significant enough material effect yet to mean or to matter. However, with autism advocacy, I think a lot of times you get a biasing effect with self diagnosis where autism advocacy stops being about the people who really need it most and start being about like the needs of a small self diagnosed population that's very loud and really knows how to talk about it on social media. And they hog all the discourse. That does happen. And that does make me concerned. I often find autistic like meme pages and things like that to be very problematic, mostly because they'll tell people you're autistic if X, and half the time it's like X is not, you're not describing autism. You're just describing a symptom that most people have and most people deal with, and you just don't realize it because you don't really talk to many people outside of your little communities. It does have some effect. It will probably have a much larger effect as time goes on. But that being said, it's fine. Like it until someone can show me that it actually does cause significant material harm, then maybe I'll start changing my tune. But yeah, up till this point, I have always considered self-diagnosis as mostly accurate, and basically the only thing that changes with self-diagnosis is if a self-diagnosed person does something or expresses something that is completely out of line with what I expect to see in most autistics, I will typically just hold that finding with less weight than I would others. So, classification schemas. One question I get is, how do you categorize and how do you cluster autistic people? Are there any discernible trends? And the short answer is yes, there are. So, I have found lots of variation and lots of interesting trends within autistic people, and within autistic people you can have various answers to various different questions, but I found that people that tend to answer questions similarly to each other all have certain traits in common. And so I have a clustering system that I've labeled cluster A to cluster P, and based on how people answer my questions, I just slot them into there. So I originally just started out with 2 clusters. So basically, when I originally started this, I wasn't like meaning to do it. I was just sorting people based on answers, and I came up with 2 cluster groups. And then I looked further into those cluster groups, and I'm like, there are actually subvariations and deviations within here. And so I made more and more. And basically, what I found is the most useful for predicting an autistic Christian or ex-Christian's answers are 4 traits. So, trait 1 is ontology, epistemology, and certainty. Like, how do you know things? What do you think things are? And how certain are you about all these things? So people who have specific forms of epistemology and certain forms of certainty, like there's a quote that like everyone is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, and that's not actually true, right? It's like a reductive thing. There, I found like differences in ontology and epistemology and certainty make like really significant effects on how an autistic person will answer their questions. And so that was my initial like categorizing. The next one is orientation to the body, physicality, and embodiment. Like how you think about your own body. Do you think it's a good thing? Do you like it? Do you want to keep it? Do you want to transcend it? Are you a transhumanist? Are you transgender? Do you have body dysmorphia? Do you have difficulties with your own body and the way that it functions and all those types of things? And how do you view your own body and physicality and the physical world? Do you prefer abstraction or embodiment? So that's another really big factor for how people answer things. And then the next one is level of emotional detachment or desire for objectivity. Often people like say like a high decoupler versus a low decoupler. Like how easily able are you to take what a person says and separate it from the person who said it and just evaluate the claim? Basically, being a high decoupler or being a low decoupler is not a good or a bad thing. They're just ways of thinking about things. And I found some autistic people are just emotionally detached and not really emotionally invested in anything and don't really have strong feelings. And others are like extremely emotionally involved and extremely emotionally attached. And their desire for objectivity is often trumped by their desire for like justice or something. Justice being however they define justice, not any sort of moral value. And then the final one is openness versus rigidity, or a sort of disgust versus curiosity. So like when they encounter a new opinion, are they like, no, this is wrong because I know what the right answer is and it's X, and so I need to explain to you why you're wrong? Or that's interesting, why do you say that? Approach to thing. And so basically on those four characteristics, I have a clustering system where I separate people, and generally speaking, this cluster system is pretty accurate in figuring out what a person's answers will be. Like often before I interview someone, I will go through their social media posts and guess based on that what group they fall into. And oftentimes, if I can get that amount of information and I can accurately assess what cluster group they're in, I can figure out what they're going to answer on things. I also do something that I call retros, or like retrospective analysis, where there are questions that I may not have asked in 20 that I do now in 2025. And so what I'll often do is I'll go back and I'll ask them what their thoughts are on a particular matter. And I've often found that if I accurately cluster them, I know how they're going to answer something if I can get a good read on them. Sometimes I can't get a good read on them, and I'm like, I'm not sure where you fit. But if I can get a good read on them, I'll have a pretty good idea of how they'll answer the retro question. Sometimes they surprise me, and sometimes there are anomalies, and not everyone has these uniform beliefs and everything like that. It's not how it works. But yeah, that's basically it. I often get asked, do I do Big Five assessments or like Myers-Briggs? I don't do Myers-Briggs. That one is not accurate and doesn't have clinical significance to it. Big Five tends to. The Big Five, or like Ocean, as it's often called. These things are useful measurements for personality, but personality is not the only measure of how a person is going to answer a question. Some of these things do overlap. So like the openness versus rigidity thing, that's like just the O in the Big Five. Right? And so sometimes these factors are important. But yeah, so for a while I got people to take a Big Five personality assessment quiz to get where they were, and then I would log that in my data. And I did that for 4 or 5 years, and I just couldn't find any meaningful discernible trends in how they would answer questions about specific types of things in their faith. I've also found that just so one of the Big Five is like extroversion, or like extroversion versus introversion. And most autistics are introverts that I talk to. Most of us are introverted. And so is that necessarily a good metric when most of your population is always just going to be one of them? Is this a meaningful distinction? And the distinctions that I talked about above, they tend to have pretty even splits amongst autistic people. Like they tend to none of those traits have 90% of autistic people are in one category and 10% are in the other. It's usually like 60 40 40 60, like 55 45, that type of thing. And yeah, so that's basically how I cluster them. A lot of people have been asking me for what type of autistic are you quiz, like one of those BuzzFeed quizzes. And I don't know, maybe one day if I get bored, I'll build one. But generally speaking, the quiz would look like the interview where I ask you all these questions and you give me one of sort of 16 responses that I typically hear. And that would sort you into your clusters. But I don't know. I don't know if that's entirely a useful thing to do. But who knows? Maybe one day. Another question I get asked is, wow, this is an enormous amount of research. This is very rigorous. This is very good. Are you going to publish in academia? And the answer is no, I am not. That is the short version. And when you ask why, it's for a lot of reasons. Basically, one of the big ones is a lot of my methods wouldn't get approved by an ethics board. There are certain things that you're not allowed to do in analysis of people groups that I've done. They're not unethical. They're not, I didn't do something morally wrong. It's just that you wouldn't be allowed to do them in a study. Like I said, I pretty much always interact with the people that I'm studying and I talk to them a lot because a lot of them need help. And I have decided that helping them is far more important than maintaining objectivity in a research project that is never going to be published. So I would probably have to stop doing that. The other thing is, I just don't have the time and the money to do it properly, so to speak. And I would basically need a team and a lot of time to do this. This is a entire PhD or postdoc in the amount of work that I've done and would not be one of like I've been told by autism researchers that I've talked to that I could probably get several degrees out of just this research if I did manage to redo it with ethics board approval. Another big thing is that I've worked with a lot of academics over the years and I have got burned by them many times, and I get really frustrated with certain aspects of academia. So there is a sort of publisher perish mindset. So the publisher perish mindset is basically you need to be getting papers out the door. And so you will often chunk, so people will like chunk papers. And so when it would actually be better to put one paper out, they take one paper and split it into four papers. There's a huge amount of stuff that with the replication crisis and like a lot of stuff where I've worked with researchers and I've been like, you're trying to p-hack your data right now. Like you may not realize that's what you're doing, but you're automatically biasing your sample set and you're not doing this properly. Like I know how you should be doing this and you're not actually doing it right. And there's often a sort of attitude of whatever, like we just need to get the paper out the door. And that's an attitude that I really just take a lot of issue with. Like I've worked with 6 different sets of researchers over the years, and there's not a single one that I am impressed with or came away from the interaction having a good idea of what autism research is. Every time I interact with them, I go, oh, I should be taking these papers way less seriously than they are because you guys aren't pre-publishing, you guys aren't pre-registering your studies, you are often manipulating them in ways that you may not realize, or maybe you do realize and you just don't care. A lot of times they'll come with a conclusion and be like, this is what we should see. So one group that I worked with was studying the double empathy problem. So the double empathy problem is something I mentioned in episode 1 or 2. And the basic gist of the double empathy problem is autistic people are often seen as having mentalizing deficits or empathy deficits where they can't understand or empathize with non-autistic people. However, they'll also point out that non-autistic people can't do that with autistic people either. And so this is called the double empathy problem, where it's not actually a deficit for autistic people. It's a problem for both autistics and non-autistics, but it's only considered a problem for autistics because they're a minority. And this is a really interesting idea. It's also like a very useful conceptual model. Like I still use it a lot. However, there are many predictions that you could make from the double empathy problem if it were actually a phenomena that my data would be really good in answering. And so I was working with them and basically showing them this is what you would do. These are the algorithms you use to do it. These are all the tools you need to do it. They didn't quite get it because they aren't like software engineers. And so I was like, okay, fine, I'll do it with you. And so I did all the data collection for them based on the parameters that we were looking for. And we did not find what we were looking for. We did not find evidence that would support the double empathy problem. And what we actually found is that autism is not the overarching factor in communication deficits or fluidity of communication, because autistic people often can't communicate with each other to save their lives. But what the actual mediating factor was like training, education, and expertise. And so what we basically came away with was that the double empathy problem is a useful explanation for things, and it's a useful shorthand to describe a phenomena that really does exist. But there isn't actually a causative mechanism behind it. What is actually going on is a set of other factors that aren't actually related to your cognitive abilities, but are more related to your background, basically. And yeah, so we found this, and they were like, oh, we wanted to show that this was a thing. And so they were like trying to get me to slice out large portions of the data so that we could get significant findings. And I was like, this is deeply unethical. Anyway, I got really mad at them and I reported them to their ethics board. And I was like, they are straight up p hacking. Like, they are straight up asking me how to p hack. And they are trying to get me to p hack, and I refuse. These people are deeply unethical, and the research they're doing is shoddy. And like, these were autistic people. These were autistic people who were like autism advocates. And they were just like producing flawed data so that it fit a pre-established narrative, instead of just saying, actually, the double empathy problem is a useful high-level conceptual tool, and it's a good communication tool to do a shorthand explanation of what's actually going on. Like, I used it in the podcast, knowing all these things, because I think it's still very useful. However, it is far from scientifically established to be an actual thing. And basically, after that experience, I was kind of like, screw you all. I'm not doing this again. I don't get paid for this. I was doing this as a volunteer, and you guys were being unethical and doing the wrong thing. I'm not joining you. I also decided later that if I did want to interact with them, I would force them to pre-register and get involved in the open science movement, where basically you say, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to find, and you publish no matter what you find, even if it's uninteresting and insignificant. Like, it's really important to do that so that you don't cause another replication crisis. But I have a feeling that a lot of autism research, at least the stuff that I've been interacting with in the last 10 years, is probably going to fail replication if you do analysis again. And I've done analysis with my own data sets, and I'm like, I can't find this. I can't find these phenomena you're describing. And I think that what you're doing is you are taking a conceptual model and trying to force that conceptual model into a box where what's actually going on is a complex interaction of a whole bunch of other things, and that these other things are actually better able to explain things, but just not cool and not really exciting. And so if you publish a paper being like, the double empathy problem probably isn't real, but it's a useful conceptual model, and instead what is actually going on is just education, and like, people with common educations are able to communicate with each other better. But yeah, there's going to be a replication crisis coming for autism research soon. That is one of my predictions, if it does. And a lot of the ways that autism research actually works is, I think, pretty deeply flawed. Another question I get is, are you going to write a book? And the short answer is, no, I'm not. And when people ask why, it's because, quite frankly, I have better things to do with my life. Writing is not something I find very easy. I have a lot of difficulty writing. If I were going to write this, I would need to write it with a co-author. It's very hard to find a co-author. It's very hard to find people who are interested in publishing these types of things. There are just so many things going on with this research that I just don't think I could get a large enough audience or a publishing deal that would be fair to the person writing the book. And I also have difficulties finding other autistic people who would be good at writing the book. Like, there's a reason I did this in podcast form, and that's just because it's easier to get my thoughts out when I just talk about them rather than writing them down in formal writing. I tried to write a book 3 times, so I have 3 drafts of this research, but every time I get to the end of the book, writing has allowed me to change the way that I think about what I wrote, and so I have to think, oh, I need to go back and rewrite this part. And that happened so many times that I was like, I just need to start from fresh. And then I would start from fresh and start going. And then I'd be like, no, I need to start from fresh again. And it was an endless looping cycle of me not being happy with what the product was at the end and me not being super enthusiastic about it. And so I just thought, screw it. I'm just going to take all these lessons learned and turn them into a podcast because that will be much easier for me to do. If at some point I was offered enough money that it made sense for me to do it, I would do it. Or if I retire, if my company IPOs and I am able to retire early, maybe I'll do it. But until then, I'm not going to do it. I often get asked, if you had a good budget and time, if you had unlimited funding and unlimited time to do this research, what would you do? And that is a great question, and I love thinking about this. I am super cognizant that my research is far from perfect. I am very aware that much of what I have done is basically a guy doing his best with the tools he has available so that he can help autistic people. But I would really like to be able to do proper science, basically, do the actual work and put in the actual work. I would, if I had unlimited money, I would get really specific, good quality controls and very good representative controls and cross comparisons. I would do way more interviews, and I would probably structure the interviews very differently. I would love to be able to get people to help with surveys and question design, and then have a population that I could reliably send out surveys to who would reliably respond. I know many people who are able to do that, but honestly, it's easier just talking to them than writing out the surveys. But yeah, that would be really great. I am definitely an amateur when it comes to surveying and when it comes to writing good survey questions and when it comes to doing all this. A lot of this work was just learning on the fly and then reading books about how to properly design surveys and things like that, and then taking the lessons learned from those and my own surveying woes and redoing them. And it would just be, I'd love to have a team that I could just go back to and we can sit down and design good, proper experiments and then run them. People are like, why don't you go into research then? That sounds like exactly what you would do. And the short answer is I make way more money not doing autism research. And so I don't know. Maybe in another life, maybe after I retire, I'll actually go into this and then do it for a living. But basically, at this point in my life, it just doesn't make sense to do it. I have a wife and kids that I need to take care of and that I need to care about far more than my pet autism research. And for that, just getting better pay is way more important than doing something that I love in this case. That being said, I still like my job, so I'm not it's not a tragic story is basically what I'm trying to say. It just feasibly and logistically doesn't make sense for me to do it. I would love to be able to work with some people from a psychology department to better improve my clustering and profiling systems and to do a proper autism personality assessment that has good and useful predictive power. Basically, what I built was just one that I found that works, and I built it on the fly as I was doing the research, which is not ideal, but it is what it is. And I know a lot of what I did is good enough. Like it functionally serves the purpose so that I could get useful data that can inform people and help people, and just like getting enough data that other people can use it and other people can make good use of it. I would love to get some research assistants to go through specific data and demographics and compare all these things, and just to do a lot of the bulk data analysis that is just extremely time consuming, and to redo it and then to do it on all sorts of other questions. Just having other guys who can do grunt work. When I was putting together the podcast, I was looking to hire someone to help me sort out my notes and keep things organized and make sure I got everything right. And I was talking to a bunch of people, and I was also like, how comfortable are you reading like suicide notes and stuff like that? And they were like, what? Anyway, I scared a lot of them off, being like, you're going to see some extremely disturbing things in this data. I just need you to know that before you agree to this. And they would be like, what kind of things? And I would explain to them, and they'd be like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. Yeah, fair enough. This is not work for the week. Yeah, and I just love to be better able to organize things, and I wish I had started from way early on being better organized. Like, one of my biggest regrets for this research project is not having my things sorted out before I started doing the research project. I wish I would have done things like pre-publishing. I wish, mostly because it'd be funny. It'd be funny how wrong I was in all of my predictions for what I thought the data were going to look like. Because like when I started this, I had very different ideas about autism, very different ideas about Christianity, and my perspective has just changed enormously from doing this research and just seeing the very wide breadth of autistic experiences. Like, I thought most autistic people would be like me, and they're not. Um, yeah. And so those things, having someone who can help me with the executive function stuff that's involved with research, I would just, that's what I would do. And like, I'd be happy to redo all my research if it meant that I was properly funded and had the right people to do it, but I don't, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. So yeah, I've got questions on what do you plan on doing in the future for research? And that's a good question. And the answer is wherever the wind carries me. Basically, I have no plans. Basically my biggest plan is just to fill in gaps. So doing interviews mostly with autistic women is something I've tried to do a lot more of, just so I can get more data points in those demographics. That being said, I think I have got a lot of autistic women in my demographic pools, and I have got a lot of like really good quality data on these types of things. But I would just like better quality data to see if I miss something. And maybe there is a whole subtype or cluster of autistic women out there that I've just missed, and we can create a cluster O. I don't know, stuff like that. Mostly at this point, I've collected so much data and I've done so much research that I don't have huge aspirations for doing a lot more of it, mostly because I've answered all my questions to my satisfaction. If in the future another question comes out, I don't know, let's say they invent another type of culture war issue that I have not foreseen and not thought of, I'd like to gauge autistic opinion about that, things like that. I would also like to do collaborations with people. So, work with other people in the autism space or in the Christianity space, just to get my research out there, get more eyes on it, get more ears on it. I'd love more opportunities to spread the word and to help autistics. I've gotten a lot of feedback from the podcast where they're like, I am so happy you did this. This has been very meaningful to me, which just feels really good knowing that I've helped people and knowing that this can help other people. I just want to look for more opportunities to let other people know about this research that I'm doing, and maybe give them answers to stuff that they previously hadn't known that there actually were answers to. I'd also love to get into just a lot of the extremely weird stuff and the crazy things that I witnessed over all this that aren't necessarily related to Christianity, but just funny. Latin Mass furries. They exist. They're like groups of autistic Christian furries who meet on VR chat and do a Latin Mass Vespers. It's pretty cool. They invited me along. I interviewed a whole bunch of them, and yeah, they're all cool people. They're all great people. I've nothing against the Latin Mass furries. It's very hard for me to have anything against them. I just thought it was so fun, and that stuff doesn't really make it into the podcast. And I have like thousands of things about that I just think are really fun that I'd love to do. Another thing I would love to do more of is, you could probably tell by my Twitter or by my posting that I have this like weird fascination with the Christian to Radfem pipeline, or the Radfem to Christian pipeline. And I would love to spend a lot more time like diving into it and articulating it and explaining it, because I personally think it's just like extremely interesting. Not necessarily the anti-trans stuff, but just how conservative Christian women derive the tenets of radical feminism through nothing but the sheer power of autism and the weight of Christian misogyny. I find that, I don't know, I think it's fascinating that you have these two very different groups that would have never met each other, independently developing the same types of ideas, and now they're meeting and like documenting all those meetings. I find very interesting. Maddie often jokes that autistic people always have their weird little guys. We just have groups of people that we find really interesting and that we're willing to go to the mat for. And I guess mine is Christian radfems or radfem adjacent people. I don't know why I find them so fascinating, but I think it is really fascinating, and I'd love to do more about that. But I don't know if people would be interested or really care about it. Ideally, I would love to get some sort of sanction from the Anglican Church of Canada or from any Anglican church. So I'm an Anglican, and I would love for them to basically allow me to hold some sort of position where other people know I exist. And if they have autism questions, they can come to me. So I'd really like to get involved in that. For a long time, I really wanted to be a priest, but that's it's just not in the cards. It's not going to happen. I did not get through my discernment process. However, I think there is opportunity for me to do stuff as a lay minister, and I would really love for an opportunity to do that and use the sort of data-driven research that I've gotten over the years to help with that. There is just like a lot of non-Christian autism stuff that I also want to get into, just like stuff that I've found over the years. I've often thought about doing a sort of mockumentary podcast called Dispatches from the Autism Wars, where it's like basically just my stories of being in and around autism spaces and the weird and wacky things that happen as a result of it. I think it would be really fun. And another thing that I feel really strongly about is debunking and disabusing people online about their misconceptions about autism, even if they are also autistic people. Like I often find autistic advocates get a lot of stuff wrong about autism. And I'm like, I would like a chance to correct this. I would like a chance to go on record and just explain why this isn't working and why these things don't actually work, and why you're basically creating a misinformation chamber that is making the lives of autistic people measurably worse. So you need to stop doing it. That's an issue you could probably tell on Twitter that I feel very strongly about, because I'm constantly quote tweeting autism meme pages being like, this is actually wrong and dumb. But yeah, I feel really strongly about that. I have a really strong sense of we need to contend with the very cold, hard truth of reality, which is often which often does not lend itself to clean narratives. Another question I get: how do you track changes? Like, how do you know if someone changes their mind? So I do think these things called retros, where I go back in time and I ask new questions to old research participants who have proved to be good sources of data. Yeah, so basically, I find autistic people who give really high quality, thought out answers, and who have thought about and considered many things. And I ask them questions. I also ask ones who don't. And I just go back and be like, hey, what do you think about this? I go back to old interviews and I see what people say. And then all of a sudden, if they start posting something different, I'll track that change. And I usually reach out and be like, hey, I see you've changed your mind on this. Is this true? And they'll be like, yes, or no, you misunderstood that post. And it's cool. And oftentimes I'll go back and interview people where I missed a question or now I have new questions and things like that. The question that I get is, what is like the weirdest thing that you've seen? What is the funniest thing? What's the oddest thing? And yeah, so probably the weirdest thing is the one I already mentioned with the autistic Latin mass furries that meet together on VR chat to do Vespers in their personas. Most people don't understand what any of those terms mean, but yeah, it's weird in that people don't expect Latin mass furries to exist, but they do. What's the oddest thing? I don't know. I don't know what the oddest thing is. Like every autistic person is weird. There are so many things that could come up here. A lot of times it's just weird anachronistic takes on things. So they'll be like, I'm very strongly principled and I believe this. But here's an exception and another exception. And often the stark contrast between the principle and the exceptions that they make is quite odd. What's the most surprising thing? So probably the most surprising thing, or like the thing that surprised me the most, was how many autistic people I found who were extremely concerned with orthodoxy. When I initially started this research project, I did not expect to find that. I expected most autistic Christians to be liberal Christians in like liberal theology ways, but most aren't. Most are orthodox, but on the fringes of orthodoxy, and I would have never guessed that. I was also quite surprised at how many autistic clergy I found, just because one of the predictions that I made is you wouldn't find a lot of them, but I found quite a few. Another one was the one we covered last episode. We're seeing the rapid turf shift in autistic Christian women. That was really surprising. Like, I did not see that coming, and when I started seeing it coming, I started telling other people about it, and they all thought I was crazy. What's the happiest thing you've ever found, or the thing that's most uplifting? And often I love stories when autistic people just find their niche and thrive in it. So last month, I interviewed a guy who was basically unemployed, living with his parents, unable to find good, meaningful work, and loved bats. Like, loved bats. When I interviewed him, he had like bats everywhere in his room, like stuffed taxidermied bats. And he basically, his brother happened to be going to church and talking to someone who was a bat researcher for a university. And he was saying how hard it was for him to find good research people who were able to do all the field work and who just lived and breathed bats and knew everything about bats. And his brother was like, you're never going to believe this. I literally know the exact person for this job, and it's my brother. He's a bit autistic, so you'll have to deal with that. And the researcher was like, I'm autistic too. This will be a great match. And so he moved out to live with his brother, and now he just studies bats, and he's just the bat guy, and he's been doing that for a couple years, and he's just loving his life. And literally all he does all day is he like lives with his brother and his wife, and his brother drops him off at the university, and then he does bat science. And I just think that's so cool. And I love when I find stories of autistic people who just like are going through a bit of a rough patch, and then just all the stars align and they are now in their niche and thriving. Because I see a lot of the more depressing side of that where they aren't thriving, and it's just like sadness and depression and suicide attempts and just like misery on misery. And so I don't know, I find it very uplifting when I find an example of a person who got out of that. It makes me very happy when I see that. What is the funniest thing? Probably the autistic Christian radfens. I think they're so funny. I love making memes and sending them to my friends who are in that community. I've accidentally started like a cult of Thecla in autistic Christian women who have like took and redefined Thecla as this like symbol of autistic Christian radfems. I think it's great. I think it's so funny, and it like I don't know. I think it's hilarious just because it's so odd and they're so intense. But yeah, that's probably the funniest thing. Most depressing thing. Oh man, I could fill books with all the depressing stuff that I've seen. The amount of sort of desperation, suffering, depression, suicidal ideation. Another really big one that I see is clergy burnout. So autistic clergy who don't realize they're autistic, who become clergy and then start going through their life as a minister and just autistic burnout, slam into a wall and don't recover. And yeah, that's super depressing for me to watch, and I see a lot of it. Like one of the biggest overall trends is just there's a lot of sadness and a lot of struggling and a lot of suffering in the autism community. Yeah, that's the most depressing. What's the most shocking thing? So the most shocking thing is, so as many of you may know, I used to work in military intelligence. That was what I did. Suicide bombers were like a sort of conundrum to me. Like, why would you do that? And I started realizing that there were maybe more overlaps with suicide bombers and autistic people than I had potentially seen before. And so I put out a survey and I asked a whole bunch of autistic people if they could understand and empathize with suicide bombers. And the number of people who were like, yeah, no, completely, definitely, I empathize with them, I understand them. And they're like, I could see myself being one if I was in their situation. Is like, holy crap, did not expect that. Okay, yeah, there was just a lot of internal self-reflection after that, and made me have to rethink and reconsider things. But the number of just all or nothing, ready to go, ready to lay your life down for the cause autistics, and just their complete lack of self-preservation or desire for self-preservation was ooh. That is surprising. So finally, I get the question, what effect has this research had on you? And so before I answer this, I don't want to create like a oh poor me type of deal. I signed up for this. I knew this was going to happen. I knew what I was getting into, but it has not changed me for the better. I'll say that. It has made me a lot more bitter and critical and cynical than I initially thought I would have been. It has affected me quite negatively. Like, I've seen a lot of just not great things. I hear a lot about church abuse. I hear a lot about high control religion just destroying autistic people. This research is probably the biggest reason that I left neurodiversity activism, mostly because I was doing this broad research and I was involved in neurodiversity activism. This is based on like a South Park episode where there's this superhero called Hindsight Man, and there's a building that's on fire, and Hindsight Man shows up and is like, that building should have had a fire escape, and then just leaves. So thanks, Hindsight Man. I find in the autism community, there's often a superhero I call Structural Man that just shows up to the issues and are like, this problem is structural. Okay, cool. Thanks. Does that help anything or anyone? Is it really structural, or is your framing of it as something that's structural? And a lot of like quoting of papers that have failed replication but say nice and comforting things about autistic people instead of recognizing the dark side of it. Like, I see a lot of autistic Nazis, a lot of autistic extremists, a lot of autistic people who have a desire to do violence to other people as a result of the way that they have been treated in society. And I don't think that's good. And I think we should talk about that and try to, like, the sort of optimistic, positive framing of autism for me has died that I used to have. I used to be like, it's great. this is awesome. But now I'm not autism negative or autism positive. I'm autism neutral, where I just see these things as like being autistic isn't good. Being autistic isn't bad. It just is. And it comes with a lot of struggles. And it comes with a lot of issues. And it comes with a lot of struggles and issues that a lot of people have to deal with. And I think we should be focused on trying to make sure that the burden is lesser on them than solving problems that in a way that really won't actually solve anything but will make you feel really good about it, or things like that. The reality of the complexity of autism and all the things that come along with it often is very difficult. Like, people try to draw narratives of what autism is and frame it in a way where it's like positive and uplifting, and I'm always like, it's complicated. It's not quite that straightforward. And complexity isn't bad, it just makes comfortable narratives that we tell about ourselves less coherent and less effective. And I just find we talk about autism in a way that's often divorced from actual data that exists, and the data that exists does not paint a clear narrative. And oftentimes something that happens is in activist circles, you meet other autistic people who are interested in being in activist circles. And so you develop a perception that autism is what you find in activist circles. And it creates this sort of self reinforcing feedback loop where you think all other autistic people are like you because all the ones you meet are like you, without really considering that the reason that they're all like you is probably because the type of activity that you're doing tends to attract a certain type of person. And it just so happens that you're that type of person. And this isn't actually what autism is. This is a very skewed, biased sample set. Like, one of the things that I'm constantly harping on is people who are like, autistic people have a strong sense of social justice. And it's like, okay, but you understand that strong sense of social justice is getting people outside an abortion clinic to pray a rosary and like fighting against these things as well. Like, you understand that, and they're like, no, that's, those people aren't autistic. And it's like, they are. There's a lot of them. I don't know what to tell you. And there's a lot of people find it very hard to acknowledge the difficult things. And that aspect has been incredibly hard on me mentally, to just have to deal with and have to confront. And I went from being very optimistic to not at all, and to being like, this is just what it is. But yeah, so those are all the research questions that I get. Hopefully this has been helpful. My name is John. You can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn, or on Blue Sky at ChristianityOn. You can email me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. See you later.